Hello, comrades. What is a novel and why you should read the five-star 1977 Ghanaian classic, or Sister Killjoy, even if it might not exactly be a novel? Now, I don't mean in terms of length. I mean, technically, it would be a novella. There are certain word length requirements for it to be a novel versus a novella, but I think in kind of a modern publishing context, that's kind of a petty dispute. I would consider a novel of this length or a book of this length to be a novel just based on word count, even though it has a lot of white space, so it's not quite as long as it appears because there's a lot of poetry, which I think gets much further into the heart of the matter. As you see, it's broken up into four sections, and the first is the shortest, and it really felt more like a long form poem to me than a novel. It really didn't feel like it was completely written in prose. The middle two sections go back and forth between prose and poetry. And so you have a lot of prose and it's interrupted by poetry. But honestly, sometimes it feels more like the poetry is being interrupted by the prose. Really, the poetry is the heart of the book, and the prose is just kind of connecting it and guiding you and leading to certain interpretations of the poetry often. It really feels like you're reading this book for the poetry itself. However, the final part, the last part, is a letter written by the main character. So the prose sections before this are written in a third person perspective, and that's just how it is. It's a third person perspective, and the poetry is so intimate, even though it doesn't quite have any pronouns. It's not from a first person perspective, it's not from a third person perspective. It really feels like it's written from a first person perspective. You really feel like you're in someone's head when you're reading the poetry. But then it's a completely different voice when you get to the final part, and it's the main character finally talking directly to you, to someone. She's actually writing a love letter to her estranged lover, and it's a complete voice change. And it really is a very oddly formatted book that I don't know that it could quite be considered a novel. It's really more like a poetry collection with some weird prose tags and a letter tacked on at the end, but it doesn't sound very good, but it does form a whole, a complete whole. It's about our sister, who everyone just calls Sissy. She's our main character, and she's on a journey from Ghana to her stay in Germany and England. It's not exactly plot heavy. Our sister's not on a quest. She's not seeking some holy grail. She does develop as a character, though, and it really is about that development, about moments of revelation and realization that she has throughout her journey. Part 1. What's the deal, Grace? There's this really powerful part at the first section where, while in Germany, she hears a woman say to her young child, "Das schwarze Mädchen," the black girl. And so our sister's confused, and she realizes that she is the only black person around her, that everyone else has the skin color of pickled pig, that white people look like pickled pig, and she's surrounded by people who look like pickled pig, and she looks around and she wants to vomit. And then immediately she's ashamed by her reaction, ashamed by her disgust, and quote, "For the rest of her life, she was to regret this moment when she was made to notice differences in human coloring." And this book really is built on these moments that, from the outside, from an outside perspective of someone around her, would seem small, but for her are huge. Either as sudden revelations or something that lives in the back of her mind, slowly changing her perspective as she processes what she has experienced. I think the poetic interruptions work really well, and for me, made the book a lot more real and relatable, honestly, which might sound a little weird at first, but I've never gone on a great adventure that was tied up in a neat narrative bow, but I have had many of these moments that live on in my head, that have changed how I view the world, that have I've really had to process. I have to sit with. I've had to think about. Or even the moment felt like big sudden changes, and this book captures those moments in a way I've never seen. And no, I may or not have gone any great quest to go find a grail or anything, but I have traveled to another country for a few months to study, and I don't think I could put my experiences into a 2 hour blockbuster coming of age film. But I do think I could write a few poems about it. Not nearly as good as this, but I could try. There could be an intent made in a way I couldn't without really kind of changing my story if I wanted to try and adapt it into, a film setting or more of a traditional novel setting. And the poetic style of this book really kind of gives these moments the contemplation and space they need, so we can really think about them and feel them. Like that moment when she's in that place and she wants to vomit because all the people around her look like pickled pigskin. Why is that the moment that she realized white people had the same skin tone as pickled pigs? Like, surely she had seen a white person before and she'd seen pickled pig before, and she could have just made that connection at any time. Why did she feel ashamed of her action? Why was she to regret this moment for the rest of her life? I do not think that her problem was with the appearance of white people, as if for no particular reason she connected our appearance to something repulsive. I think this was the first moment she felt herself as being perceived as black, as racialized. W.B. Du Bois, in The Souls of Black Folks, describes black Americans as being veiled off from the world of white Americans and, quote, gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. And I really do have to wonder if that's akin to what her sister felt in that moment, is double consciousness and her awareness of being separated from the world of the Germans and being perceived from the eye of the perspective of the Germans as another, as someone else, as someone in a separate category of this racialized category of black. But I do think there has to be at least another part to it. Immediately after she's regretful and ashamed, this book says, quote, no matter where she went, what anyone said, what they did, she knew it never mattered. But what she always came to know was that someone somewhere would always see any kind of difference as an excuse to be mean, a way to get land. And this really makes it sound like an awareness of small differences is a kind of crossroads, a moment where someone can take it and choose to use it to justify violence and theft against another. I think at its root, this is how racism. I think at its root, this is how racism must have, at the very least, started. Racists justify doing wrong things by breaking people up into categories. Those with pale skin were part of one group, and those with dark skin were part of another. And now that those racists have inflicted this categorization upon the world, we are forced to see it. Our sister is forced to see it. She's forced not just to see that the Germans around her are pale as a matter of their appearance, but they are part of the category of white. She does not see it because it comes naturally to her or because of any innate reality, but because the world around her operates with these sets of categories. I often think about how this kind of category could be based on any kind of other difference. Like, I might notice when a white person has brown hair or dark hair, but I have no category to place them into. If my ancestors had decided that those with black hair were a completely different category, if they belonged to a different category, then we would necessarily place them into that category. And then new communities, dialects, musical styles, and culture would form around that black hair community as opposed to the community formed around having brown hair. Part 2, Exoticism and Cultural Disconnection. As someone who is very interested in languages and language, there is one particular stylistic choice that sticks out to me. The German characters are written with phonetic spelling to show their accent, their German accent. But our sister is described as speaking with received pronunciation, that is the kind of posh British pronunciation you might see on a BBC News broadcast. And obviously, there was no way to write her dialect, her accent differently. Our sister, however, does not speak German. So even though she is the one who is exoticized and from a different country, the Germans around her are perpetually speaking in a second language with the accent of that second language. And this makes it seem like she's not really in German culture, but rather in an Anglo bubble within German culture, never touching it directly. And I do have to wonder if this bubble protected her or warped her perception. And there is a kind of undercurrent throughout the text, and very often, very explicitly so, of this idea that this book, which was written in the 1970s, is not so far removed from the horrific events of World War II. And I do have to wonder what it was like for the Germans who lived through the rise of literal Nazism in Germany to see people come to Germany from Africa and India and other countries to study and work as doctors and other professionals. Our sister describes living in a literal castle for the youth program she's in, and thinks about the peasants who must have built the castle for some noble long ago. Our sister describes walking down the same streets as Nazi merchants not too long ago, just a few decades really. However, I do not want to make it seem like such surrealism, such historical surrealism, is limited to Germany at this particular moment in history, or even just to Germany in general. I think the act of thinking about the history of any place, truly thinking about it, is equally surreal in any place. But when a place is so foreign and its history so prominent in your mind, or even often as is often the case within living memory, it makes that surrealism much clearer. I think we were never really so far from history as it might seem. This book was written just 3 decades after World War II, and here in the US, my grandparents remembered Jim Crow and were old enough to have met people that were enslaved or fought in the Civil War. But really, I think it's so much easier to see another land when you are in another land to see how close its history is. And although she is always speaking her native language, our sister is always perceived as exotic, the only African in the Bavarian town where she spends a good portion of this book. But even still, it must be acknowledged that despite the fact that she's speaking her native language without what would be considered a foreign accent, that she is indeed speaking a language that was forced onto her people. Really, just like the events of the Civil War or Germany, were not that long ago. And neither really was the colonization of Ghana, the acts that led to her speaking English, and not a language like Akan, that is native to Ghana. In the letter at the end of the book, her sister says, I've only been able to use a language that enslaved me, and therefore the messengers of my mind always come shackled. And, I've read that part, and it's really just like, damn, like what do you do with that? How do you interpret that? How do you bring that into your own world, to think of the perspective of someone who is so aware of colonization, how colonization has affected them, how it's shaped who they are, and how it's continuing to hurt them. But if you are in a situation like that, like me, you aren't really continually hurt by colonization. There might be other systems, there might be systems of prejudice around religion or class or race, but there isn't the same colonization that is affecting your entire country the way it is for someone in Ghana, especially someone in Ghana in the 1970s whose history of colonization was so recent. We're talking about someone whose own grandfather was killed by colonists. Even in Mexico and Latin America, many parts of the world, independence was further ago. It was long ago, and it's easier to separate how you speak the language from the fact that it is the colonizer's language. Especially, I think that's one of the reasons it's so interesting that she's described as speaking with, this kind of posh BBC received pronunciation, because it's not like the stereotype people have of people from Africa who speak English, but there are a lot of people who did learn that English, and they sound very British, and they don't have an accent like the other people who learned the English language from their place. They sound foreign. They sound like they speak the language of another person. And she is treated as different and exotic, but throughout the book, there is a sense that parts of Europe have been forced onto Ghana, forced onto her sister, and not just her language, but institutions, aspects of her culture, even European names and naming conventions have been forced onto them and onto her. And I think that's one of the most powerful parts of this entire book. In her poem, reflecting on how she has a Christian name, because her second name, her Christian name of baptism, is Maria or Mary. She talks about how Europeans successfully taught her country that in order to be a child worthy of heaven, they must have a Christian name, and how there were many native African naming conventions, but they've all been abandoned because the person could have 10 names, but they would all just mean pagan and idolater to the supposedly good Christians, as if the angels themselves up in heaven could not learn how to pronounce a name difficult for European tongues. Part 3. Brain Drain. The book at its core deals with the theme of leaving Ghana, or really anywhere in the Commonwealth, whether it is for education or simply to stay over there and never come back. We say our sister is angry with an Indian doctor who never returns to India. She says to him, why aren't you helping your own people? Why are you helping these Germans? She's angry when she comes to London to see the conditions that the other black people and immigrants live in. She's angry at the most successful among them for staying and for abandoning their people. And this book does not portray this as a single-sided argument. There are people with good reasons, or the very least thought out reasons, for staying, that they couldn't even earn a third of what they earn in England, that they couldn't be able to help their people back home the same way, they couldn't do the same level of groundbreaking research, that they couldn't help their community by exemplifying how someone from Ghana can be intelligent, can be an intelligent, groundbreaking researcher, and really not just as an example for Ghana, but for the entire world, that people from Ghana can do this. And remember, this is written in the 1970s. This is a decade after things like Jim Crow in the US, and currently apartheid in South Africa. When her sister was in Germany, she didn't see racism, not as a systemic evil that it is, not like what she can see in London, where there are many black people suffering under a racist system. Our sister meets a Welsh maid who, quote, could have passed for her soul sister, and several white people were all too eager to identify with her, like a Scot who insisted that the Scots were like Africans who had formed tribes and bravely fought the English, but ignored anything bad the Scots might have done, or how they themselves might have prospered from colonialism. Or a German-born American professor of humanities who thinks the Germans, the Irish, and the Africans, in that order, are all unified by the oppression they have faced, but can't seem to explain how the Germans are oppressed or fathom that maybe there are other groups, like the Jews or African Americans, who might be oppressed as well. Our sister finds herself in charge of reassuring a German that Africans think of Mercedes and Volkswagens when they think of Germany, not of racism, because for some reason, the perception of racism is much more important than the possibility that there might actually be racism in Germany. The young German seems only concerned with whether Africans thought of Germans as racist, and not if, our sister had experienced any actual racism while in Germany. Ultimately, our sister finds a deep loneliness abroad. That is what she finds at the end of this book throughout its journey. She went out into the world and it was lonely. Part 4. Was this a novel? I loved this book. I found it deep and thought-provoking, but I'm left with the question of whether exactly this was a novel per se. The body of the prose is written in the third person, but the poems feel like a deep, reflective first-person analysis, even though they are neither in first person nor third person. And the switch to the first person in the letter at the end makes it feel like an entirely new voice, an angrier, more confrontational voice, as if throughout the entire book she was building up a slow volcano that needed to erupt at the end. But it's also a voice that expresses a love we never see in the third person. So it's hard to tell how much the book was waiting to show us who the main character was on a deeper level, not talking to some European under the constraint of her double consciousness, how much it was just her final metamorphosis, and how much was just the simple fact that we just now are hearing from our sister directly. Because throughout the entire book, she's called our sister. She can almost feel like more of a character in a fable than a person at times. As if she could have been any Ghanaian girl making the same kind of revelations anyone would make on their trip to Europe. But reading her letter directly, she does. It seems like a necessary moment, at least for me, because she feels like she comes into being a character on her own more so than in the rest of the book. But it's hard to argue this is the traditional shape of a novel. Its plot structure breaks off from the norm so much. And the forward in my edition calls it a novel. I don't often read the forward to a work of fiction, but I felt the need to go back and read the forward this time. And one particular quote stands out to me. Supposedly, another great writer read this book and said, and I quote, "It's like what a designer of airplanes would condescend to put together if such a person was asked to design a car." This seems like a marvelously elegant sentence, but I don't think it's entirely clear what it means. At a glance, an airplane is much harder to design than a car, and an airplane designer could make a car far more impressive than a car designer. But honestly, I'm not sure if that's true. I suspect there are different qualities of airplanes and cars, and the designers of both are doing the best to design the best possible version of both, and always finding improvements. And a car designer would probably be an expert in the problems one would worry about while designing cars. But an airplane designer would be at a disadvantage, being an expert in airplanes. And I think there is something very important about the word condescend here. It's like it's the kind of car an airplane designer would condescend to make it. It sounds as if maybe the airplane designer doesn't really take the task seriously and isn't really building a car, at least not one in any serious capacity, as if they view a car as beneath them. Now, I don't think the author thought that writing a novel was beneath them, but I do think she came at it with poetry in mind, and I think it worked out marvelously in this case. It captured so many thoughts and feelings that felt so real, but didn't necessarily fill out a conventional novel. So I'm willing to say this right here isn't quite a novel, but it is one of my favorite books. It's time for everyone's favorite reality TV show. What words did Liam look up while reading this? So first up we have Azania, or Azania. This is an ancient term the Greeks and Romans used for the region of East Africa, or a region in East Africa. It's also a state in modern Somalia. But in this book here, it's a non-standard name for the Republic of South Africa. Kumis is a fermented drink made from mare's milk. I think it's common on like the European steppes. It's a traditional drink. I don't know how popular it is still, who knows. Carrion, it's the flesh of a dead animal or person, and it's related to the Spanish word caroña, which I did know before I knew the English word, which is a little funny. There's Burgomaster, which is a German mayor. There's Gari and Ugali, which are respectively cassava flour and cornmeal porridge. Expurgate, which means to censor. Gherkin, which is a kind of small cucumber. Rement, which means clothing. Pesewa and Kobo, which are respectively the currency of Ghana and a Nigerian coin. And finally, ecumenical, which means universal, particularly when it's referring to unifying Catholicism and Protestantism. There was like an ecumenical movement to bridge the gap between those two slightly different versions of Christianity. Now, if you want to talk about Carmilla and explore the topics of vampires and what they are, and talk about Twilight a little bit, you can click over here. But drop me a like before you go. And remember, good night, good day, good potato.